The cold had teeth that night. It bit through the wool of Mabel's cloak, crept past the thin linen of her dress, and settled deep into her bones like something that had always lived there. She kept her eyes fixed on nothing, on the middle distance, on the gray blur of shapes she had trained herself to see without truly seeing, and she moved through the crowded market square the way she always had. Slowly, carefully. One hand extended just enough to seem uncertain, fingers brushing the rough wooden edge of a vendor's cart as she passed. Don't look directly at anything. Don't react too fast. Let them believe it. 10 years was a long time to practice a lie. 10 years was long enough that the lie had become its own kind of truth. A second skin worn so tightly she sometimes forgot where it ended and she began. The village of Ashfen smelled of pine smoke and wet earth that evening. The first frost of the season had arrived 2 nights before, and the market vendors were bundled in thick furs, their breath rising in pale clouds as they called out prices for root vegetables, dried herbs, salted meat. Somewhere behind her, a horse stamped impatiently against the frozen ground. A child laughed. Someone argued over the weight of a grain sack. Mabel heard all of it. She always heard everything. That was the cruelest part of the gift the moon had given her. Sharper senses, deeper instincts, a body built for something she had spent a decade refusing to become. An omega, unmated, unclaimed. And as long as the world believed her blind, she intended to stay that way. She stopped at the herbalist's stall, fingers finding the edge of the wooden counter without hesitation, though she slowed the motion deliberately, let her hand search a moment longer than necessary. Mabel. The herbalist, a stout woman named Petra, with flower-white hair and kind eyes, leaned forward. Your chamomile is already bundled, and I added some dried feverfew. You mentioned headaches last week. Thank you, Petra. Mabel smiled, the soft, grateful smile she had perfected, the one that made people feel both tender and sad at once. How much do I owe? Nothing. You mended my grandson's coat last month. We're well settled. Mabel pressed 2 small copper coins onto the counter anyway. Old habit. She refused to be a burden, refused to be pitied more than was necessary. Pity kept people at a comfortable distance, but debt drew them close, and close was dangerous. She tucked the herbs into the worn leather satchel at her hip and turned to leave. That was when she felt it. A shift in the air. Something electric and ancient, like the moment before a storm breaks when every living thing goes still. The chatter of the market didn't stop, not exactly, but it changed in texture, became lower, more cautious. Feet shuffled, voices dropped. Mabel kept walking, eyes forward, slightly unfocused, chin tilted just enough to suggest she was navigating by sound and touch alone. Don't stop, don't look. But her instinct screamed. The scent hit her a second later. Leather, dark pine resin, something underneath that she had no name for. Something that wasn't quite human and wasn't quite animal. It was power, she realized. Raw and unhurried. The scent of a creature that had never once in its life been afraid of anything. Heavy boots struck the cobblestones in a slow, deliberate rhythm. One set, but surrounded by others. Lighter. Careful. Deferential. Guards. At least 4. Keep walking. You are blind. You do not know who this is. You cannot smell what you are smelling. She was nearly past the edge of the square when the boots stopped. You. The voice was low. Not loud. It didn't need to be. It landed in the space between her shoulder blades like a hand pressed flat against her spine. Mabel kept moving. 2 more steps. The woman in the gray cloak. She stopped. Because to keep walking now, without even a flinch of acknowledgement, would be its own kind of tell. A truly blind woman would have heard that voice and turned toward it, uncertain, perhaps startled, but turned. She turned. Slowly. Eyes aimed just past his shoulder, the way she always aimed, close enough to seem like she was looking at a person, far enough to seem like she was missing the details. She missed nothing. He was enormous. Not in the exaggerated way of a man who had simply grown large, but in the way of something forged rather than born, every line of him deliberate and certain. Dark braids fell past his shoulders, bound with thin cords of leather, and his eyes were the color of a winter sky at dusk, pale gray-blue, startlingly clear. He wore black leather armor across his chest, buckled with thick straps, a heavy fur mantle across his shoulders that shifted when he breathed. There was a long-healed scar along his jaw, pale against the darker skin beneath his short beard. His arms were bare below the shoulder, wrapped at the forearms in brown leather bracers, and he stood in the freezing night air as though the cold was beneath his notice. He was looking directly at her, not at the crowd, not at the market, at her. Mabel felt the instinct rear up inside her, the deep biological pull of an omega standing before an alpha of incomprehensible power, and she crushed it down with 10 years of practiced will. She tilted her head slightly, let her eyes drift past him, unfocused. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't hear. Was someone speaking to me?" Silence. One of the guards behind him shifted. She caught the motion in her peripheral vision, a younger man in dark leather, hand resting near the short blade at his hip, watching her with open suspicion. The man in the fur mantle did not move, did not speak for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "What is your name?" "Mabel," she answered. "I'm a seamstress. I live at the edge of the village." She paused, let the smallest tremor enter her voice. Not fear, but the practiced uncertainty of someone who couldn't see who was speaking to them. "Forgive me. I can't see your face. Should I know you?" Another silence. Longer this time. "No," he said finally. And something in the single word was unreadable. Not dismissal, not disinterest, but something more careful than either. "You may go." Mabel dipped her chin, a small, careful bow, the kind a woman of no particular rank would offer a stranger of obvious power, and turned away. She kept her pace even, steady. Her heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she was certain he could hear it. "He can hear it," some deep part of her whispered. "He can hear everything." She didn't look back. She walked the length of the market square, turned down the narrow lane toward the east edge of the village, and only when she was certain she was fully out of sight did she allow herself to press one hand flat against the cold stone wall of a building and breathe. Her fingers trembled against the rough granite. Because the Alpha King of all Lycan territories, Dominic, whose name was spoken in careful whispers from one end of the known world to the other, had looked directly at her. And she was not at all certain he had believed a single word she'd said. She didn't sleep that night. Mabel lay on her narrow cot, staring at the ceiling she pretended not to see, listening to the wind push against the shutters of her small cottage. The fire in the hearth had burned low, and the smell of pine smoke and cold ash filled the single room. Her room, her sanctuary, the 4 walls she had built her careful life inside. The cottage was modest to the point of severity. A cot with a wool blanket worn thin at the edges, a table with 2 chairs, one of which she had repaired herself after a leg cracked under the weight of a heavy bolt of fabric. Shelves along one wall held her sewing supplies, spools of thread in muted colors, needles wrapped in cloth, scissors she kept sharp enough to cut a whisper. A small iron pot hung above the hearth. A single tallow candle sat on the windowsill, half burned. She never lit it. There was no point. Not because she was blind, but because the darkness felt safer. In the dark, no one could watch her eyes and notice that they moved too quickly, caught too much, tracked a moth across the room with the precision of someone who could see every wing beat. She pressed her forearm over her face and exhaled slowly. Dominic. The name settled in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She hadn't heard it spoken aloud in years. Not here. Not in Ashfen, where the people were simple and the world felt far away. But she had heard it before, a long time ago, when she was still a girl living inside a pack that treated its omegas like furniture. Useful when needed, invisible otherwise. The Lycan King, the last of the pure bloodline, the alpha who commanded not one pack, but all of them. Every territory from the frozen northern ranges to the salt marshes in the south bent their knee to him, and had for 2 decades. He traveled, they said, when it suited him. Moved through his territories unannounced, unpredictable, arriving without warning to settle disputes or remind certain alphas of the precise weight of his authority. What he was doing in Ashfen, a village with no pack, no alpha, no significance, she couldn't fathom. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself that many times before she finally slept. Morning arrived gray and reluctant, the sky the color of old pewter, clouds pressing low over the frost-stiffened fields at the edge of the village. Mabel rose before the light had fully strengthened, pulled on her heaviest wool dress, and tied her cloak over it, tucked her braid inside the hood, and went to collect water from the well at the center of the lane. She moved the way she always moved in daylight, carefully, one hand occasionally reaching to touch a familiar wall or post, eyes slightly soft, never snapping too quickly toward a sound. It was a performance with 1,000 small details, a performance she never allowed herself to rush. The lane was quiet at this hour. Frost crackled under her boots. Somewhere above the rooftops, a rook called once and went silent. She was drawing the bucket up when she heard him. Not footsteps. She heard those too, heavy and unhurried behind her. But the scent first. Pine resin and leather, and that deep undercurrent of something older than words. Her hands tightened on the rough rope of the well. Not now. Not here. You wake early. She turned slowly. Let her eyes find the middle distance. Let her expression settle into the mild, slightly tilted head attention of a woman navigating by voice. Dominic stood at the entrance of the lane, alone this time. No guards at his back. He wore the same leather armor, but the fur mantle was gone, replaced by a heavy dark cloak that moved in the morning wind. His pale eyes were fixed on her face with the same unnerving directness as the night before. "I have a full order to finish by midweek," Mabel said. Her voice was calm. She was proud of that. "A merchant's wife wants 3 winter dresses altered. I need the morning light for the detail work." It was a reasonable answer. True enough, even. Dominic walked toward her. Not quickly, not with aggression, but with the particular unhurried confidence of a predator who has never needed to rush. He stopped a few feet away, which was closer than anyone in Ashfen ever stood to her. People kept a gentle, apologetic distance from the blind seamstress. It was instinct, or perhaps something close to guilt. He did not seem to feel either. "You live alone," he said. It wasn't a question. "I do." "No pack?" "No." "How long?" She tipped her head slightly, as though the question puzzled her. "How long have I lived alone?" "Most of my life. I came to Ashfen when I was 19. I'm 26 now." She paused. "I find I manage well enough without much company." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, but a fractional easing, a slight adjustment, as though he was recalculating something. "You're an Omega," he said. The word landed between them like an object set down on a table. Not aggressive, not demanding. Simply stated, the way a man might state that the sky was overcast. Mabel kept her face perfectly still. "Most women in a village without a pack are simply women, my lord. I'm a seamstress." "That's not what I asked." She said nothing. "You carry no pack scent," he continued, "but you carry your own. It's—" He paused, and in that pause, she felt something shift in the air between them, something neither of them acknowledged. Distinct. "I wouldn't know," she said quietly. "I was never given much education in such matters." His eyes, those pale, impossible eyes, moved across her face with a slow patience that made her want to step backward. She didn't. She stood at the well in the gray morning cold with her bucket of water and her carefully managed expression, and she waited. Someone in this village knows who I am, he said finally. By this evening, they'll have told every person here. I want you to know before they do. He reached into the fold of his cloak and produced a small thing. She caught it in her peripheral vision, but kept her gaze level. He set it on the stone edge of the well. I'm here for 7 days. If you need anything during that time, you have only to send word to the inn. Then he stepped back, and she heard the slow rhythm of his boots retreating up the lane. Mabel waited until the scent of him faded. Then she looked down at what he had left on the well. It was a small iron coin, but not currency. A token. She recognized the mark stamped into the surface even before she turned it over in her fingers. The sigil of the Lycan throne, a wolf's head inside a crescent, old and worn smooth at the edges from handling. A personal seal. Something given only deliberately. Her heart did something complicated inside her chest. She dropped the token into her satchel, picked up her bucket, and walked home without looking back. But that afternoon, when old Bren the tanner knocked on her door with wide eyes and a rushed, breathless voice to tell her that the Lycan king himself was staying at the village inn, that he had arrived with 6 guards and had dismissed 4 of them that very morning, that no one knew why he had come, or how long he intended to stay. Mabel sat at her sewing table and kept her eyes on the seam between her fingers and said nothing at all. She already knew why she was afraid. It wasn't Dominic himself, though he was certainly frightening in the way that all immovable things were frightening. Mountains, deep rivers, winter storms. It wasn't even the risk of discovery. Though that fear had been her companion for so long, it felt like a second heartbeat. What frightened her was simpler and far more dangerous than either. She had spent 10 years becoming invisible. 10 years perfecting the art of being overlooked, unclaimed, safe inside the lie of her blindness. And in 2 brief encounters, Dominic had looked at her, truly looked at her, as though she were the only clearly visible thing in the entire village. As though, out of everything in Ashfen, she was the one thing he had actually come to find. The merchant's wife was a round, cheerful woman named Heloise, who smelled of rosewater and talked without pause from the moment she arrived until the moment she left. Mabel didn't mind. Heloise's chatter filled the cottage the way a fire filled a cold room. It didn't require anything in return. It simply occupied the space and kept the silence from becoming too heavy. 3 dresses, Heloise announced, dropping a bundle of fabric onto Mabel's table with a satisfying thud. The blue wool needs the sleeves taken in. My arms have gone thinner since last winter. Isn't that strange? And the brown one needs a new hem entirely because my daughter stepped on it during the harvest festival and tore a hand's length clean off the bottom. And the green one. She paused dramatically. The green one simply needs love. It's a beautiful dress. It deserves better than what I've done to it. Mabel ran her fingers over the fabric with practiced care, letting her hands read what her eyes were already cataloging in precise detail. The blue wool was good quality, tightly woven, the seams solid. The brown linen was indeed torn badly at the hem, the threads pulled and frayed in a rough arc. The green, a deep forest shade, heavier than the others, had a split along the bodice seam, small but widening. I can have all 3 ready by Thursday, Mabel said. You are an absolute treasure. Heloise settled herself uninvited into the second chair and leaned forward with the expression of a woman who had been holding news in her chest all morning and could bear it no longer. Have you heard about the king? Mabel drew a length of thread through the eye of a needle with steady fingers. Bren mentioned something yesterday. Bren knows nothing. He only heard that the king was here. He doesn't know the rest. Heloise dropped her voice to the conspiratorial register that wasn't actually quieter than her normal speaking voice. My husband spoke to one of the guards at the inn last evening, bought him a cup of ale and asked, very casually, what business brings the Lycan king to a village like Ashfen? She paused for effect. The guard said, and I'm telling you exactly as it was told to my husband, that the king's route should have taken him through Westmark, but 3 days ago he changed direction entirely. No explanation given. Simply turned his party south and rode straight here. Mabel kept her eyes on the needle and thread. Perhaps he needed rest. The Lycan king does not come to a village of 400 people for rest, Mabel. Eloise sat back with a significant look that Mabel felt rather than saw. There is something here he wants. The words dropped into the room and sat there. Mabel tied off her thread. Will that be all, Heloise? I should start on the hem before the light fades. Heloise took the hint with her usual cheerful grace, gathered herself, reminded Mabel twice about Thursday, and swept out of the cottage in a cloud of rosewater. The door clicked shut behind her. Mabel set down the brown linen. She pressed both palms flat on the table and breathed slowly. There is something here he wants. She thought about the iron token sitting in her satchel. She had not touched it since she'd dropped it there at the well. Had not let herself look at it again. As though not looking gave her some small power over what it meant. She thought about the way he had said the word distinct, and then stopped himself. She pressed her palms harder against the table, and made herself stop thinking. On the third morning of his presence in Ashvin, Dominic found her again. She was at the east edge of the village, where the last few cottages gave way to open field, and the old pine wood began, dark and snow-dusted, stretching north toward the mountains. She walked this path every morning as part of the lie. A blind woman who knew her route so well she needed no guide, who had memorized every root and stone, who could move through familiar ground with confidence. It was one of the details she was most proud of. It made the performance feel real, rather than practiced. She heard him fall into step beside her, before she allowed herself to acknowledge him. "You walk far for a woman alone," he said. "I know this path." She kept her pace, every stone of it. "I believe you." He matched her stride easily, hands clasped behind his back, the dark cloak moving around his boots. Up close in the morning air, the pine and leather scent of him was sharper, cleaner. "I've been watching you." Her step didn't falter. That seems like an unusual occupation for a king, something that was almost a sound, not quite a laugh, more like the ghost of one, moved through him. "You're not afraid of me." "Should I be?" "Most people are." "I can't see your face," she said, and let a small smile touch her mouth. "It's difficult to be afraid of a voice." This time the silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was thoughtful, rather than measuring. Or perhaps it was both at once, and she was losing the ability to tell the difference. "What happened to your sight?" he asked. She had answered this question hundreds of times. She had a version for strangers, a version for acquaintances, a softer version for people like Petra, who asked out of genuine care. The answer she gave was always the same at its core. A fever, when she was a child, the kind that burned through a body and left changes behind. It was believable. It was common enough. It closed the question cleanly. She opened her mouth to give him that answer. "I don't remember it clearly," she said instead, which was not the practiced response, which was, in its own way, the most honest thing she'd said to him. "I was very young." He accepted this without pressing. They walked in silence for a few steps, boots crunching on the frost-hardened earth, the pine wood breathing cold and resinous around them. "Why Ashvin?" he asked then. "It's quiet." "It's forgotten." "Yes," she said softly. "That's what I said." She felt him look at her. Not the casual glance of a man making conversation, the full weight of that pale gaze, turned on her like something with mass and temperature. She kept her own eyes on the middle distance, on the gray-white edge of the wood, on nothing. "I had a sister," he said unexpectedly. The words came out in a different register, lower, less deliberate, as though they had escaped rather than been chosen. "She was an Omega. She spent most of her life trying to disappear." Mabel said nothing. Her heart moved carefully inside her chest. "She didn't manage it," he continued. "The world found her anyway. The wrong parts of it first." A pause. "She's safe now. But I think about the years she spent hiding. What it costs to live like that." The path curved gently left, following the tree line. Mabel navigated it without hesitation and felt, the slight shift in his attention as he noticed. Too smooth, too certain. She added a small stumble. Not dramatic, just a slight misplacing of her foot, a hand reaching out briefly toward the nearest tree trunk before she steadied herself. "Careful," he said. His hand was at her elbow before she had finished the motion. Warm through the wool of her cloak, steady and immediate, there and then released in the same breath, as though he had acted on instinct, and then caught himself. "Thank you," she said. But something had shifted. She could feel it in the quality of the silence between them, in the slight change in his breathing, steadier, more deliberate, the way a man breathes when he is thinking carefully about something he is not yet ready to say. She did not trust the stumble had been convincing. And 2 hours later, when she returned home and found a folded piece of parchment slipped under her door, she stood very still for a long time before she allowed herself to open it. The handwriting was stark and spare, each letter formed with the blunt precision of someone who had learned to write for function rather than elegance. "I do not come to Ashven by accident. I have been looking for someone for 3 years. I believe you may know who I am describing. I would ask only that you meet me at the village inn tomorrow at midday. You will not be required to do anything except listen. You have my word on that, for whatever a king's word means to a woman who prefers to be forgotten." Mabel read it once, folded it, pressed it flat between her palms. Then she sat down on her cot, in the dim light of her deliberately unlighted cottage, and felt the architecture of 10 years begin to shift beneath her like ground that had been solid until this moment. He was not looking for her specifically. He said he was looking for someone. That meant he didn't know yet. That meant she still had time. She told herself that. She told herself she was still safe. But she did not sleep at all that night. And when dawn came, she was already dressed, and the folded parchment was in her satchel next to the iron token, and she had already decided, without fully admitting it to herself, that she was going to go. The inn at Ashven was the tallest building in the village. 2 full stories of dark timber and old stone, with a low doorway worn smooth at the top from decades of taller men ducking through it. It smelled of wood smoke, tallow, barley ale, and the particular human warmth of a place where people gathered without ceremony. Mabel had been inside perhaps 4 times in 7 years. It was not the kind of place a woman alone visited without reason. She had a reason now. She pushed the door open at midday exactly, letting her hand find the frame with deliberate care, stepping over the threshold with the measured patience of someone navigating an unfamiliar interior. The common room was quiet at this hour. 2 old men playing at dice in the far corner, a young woman wiping down tables with a gray rag, the innkeeper himself behind the counter stacking clay cups. They all looked up. She felt their attention the way she always felt it. A slight pressure, a collective softening, the particular quality of a room adjusting itself around someone it considered fragile. She hated it. She had hated it for 10 years. She bore it anyway. "Mabel." The innkeeper, a heavy-set man named Oswin with a permanently red nose and genuinely kind eyes, came around the counter immediately. "Here, let me—" "I'm all right, Oswin, thank you." She smiled at the space just past his shoulder. "I'm here to meet someone. He'd left word for me." Oswin's eyebrows climbed his forehead, and she knew without looking directly at him that he was surprised, that the blind seamstress from the East Lane having a midday meeting with the Lycan king was not information he had been prepared for. "Right," he said carefully. "Yes. He's taken the back room. I'll show you through." The back room was small and warm, with a single window overlooking the inn's rear yard, where 2 horses stood tied at a post, their breath rising in white clouds. A fire burned in a low hearth. The table was plain oak, scarred with years of use, and Dominic sat at it with a clay cup in front of him and a map spread beneath his forearms. She caught it clearly in the half-second before she adjusted her gaze to its practiced unfocus. He stood when she entered. She noted that, filed it away. A king who stood when she entered a room. "You came," he said. "You asked," she replied, She moved to the chair across from him, letting her fingertips brush the table edge as she settled into it. Oswin retreated and pulled the door closed behind him. They were alone. Dominic sat again. He did not speak immediately, which she was beginning to understand was characteristic of him. He collected himself before words, the way a man picks up a tool and considers it before use. She folded her hands on the table and waited, eyes aimed at the middle space between them. "I'll tell you what I know," he said, "and then I'll ask you only one thing." "All right." 3 years ago, a woman left the Duskville pack in the Northern Territory. She left in secret, in winter, with nothing except what she could carry. He paused. She was an Omega, who had been held in the pack against her will for 6 years, not as a member, but as a servant, used for labor and kept from any contact with the outside world. When their alpha discovered she had made contact with a traitor passing through, he decided to claim her to prevent her from leaving. She escaped the night before the claiming ceremony. Mabel's hands were perfectly still on the table. "The alpha of Duskvale is a man named Rodan," Dominic continued. "He has since filed a formal claim of desertion with my court, requesting authority to retrieve her. That claim has been sitting on my council's table for 2 years. My council recommended I approve it. A beat. I didn't." She said nothing. Her heart was a fist knocking against the inside of her ribs. "I've been tracing her route instead," he said. "She moved south, stayed nowhere long enough to be found. About 7 years ago, the trail went cold in this general region." He picked up the clay cup, turned it once in his hand, set it down without drinking. "I'm not here to return her to Duskville, Mabel. I want to be clear about that before anything else." The fire snapped in the hearth. Outside, one of the horses shifted against its post. "Why are you here then?" she asked. Her voice was even. She was proud of that. "Because Roden's patience has run out. He's stopped waiting for my authorization. 3 weeks ago, he sent trackers south, private men, not pack soldiers, which means he's operating outside my authority deliberately." Dominic's jaw tightened, just slightly. "If they find her before I do, there is nothing I can do after the fact. A claiming on unclaimed territory is difficult to reverse." Mabel looked at her hands, at the familiar map of small scars and needle prick marks across her fingers, the evidence of 10 years of honest work. She thought about the girl she had been at 19, thin and cold and terrified, running through the snow with one leather boot sole coming apart, certain that every sound behind her was the last sound she would hear before they dragged her back. "You said you would ask me one thing," she said quietly. "Yes. Ask it." He leaned forward slightly, forearms on the table, those pale eyes steady and direct and entirely without the performance of authority. Just a man asking a question he needed answered. "Have you seen a woman matching that description in or around Ashfen?" he said. "Traveling alone. Possibly settled nearby under a different name. An Omega without a pack. Living quietly." The question sat between them. Mabel raised her eyes. Not to the middle distance. Not to the practiced unfocus. She raised them and looked directly at him, for the first time, fully and without pretense. It lasted only 2 seconds. Perhaps 3. Then she dropped her gaze back to her hands. But in those 2 or 3 seconds, she watched his expression change. It was subtle. A slight stilling. A minute adjustment around the eyes. The particular quality of a man who has just confirmed something he already suspected, but did not allow himself to believe until this moment. The silence that followed was the loudest she had ever sat inside. "No," she said, her voice perfectly calm. "I don't believe I have." Dominic said nothing for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was the same, low, unhurried, giving nothing away. "Thank you for coming." She rose from the table, found the edge of it with her fingers, moved toward the door. She was almost through it when he spoke again. "Mabel." She stopped, did not turn. "Rodan's trackers." His voice was careful, deliberate, each word placed with precision. They arrived in the region 2 days ago. I have reason to believe they're moving village to village, asking questions about unmated Omegas living without packs. A pause that felt like a hand pressed briefly against her shoulder. I would advise anyone living quietly in this area to be particularly careful for the next several days. She stood in the doorway for a moment. The fire behind her threw her shadow long and thin across the floor. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. "Thank you, my lord." She walked out into the common room, past Oswin and his carefully neutral expression, out through the low front door and into the cold noon air. She walked the length of the main lane. She turned into the east path. She walked all the way to her cottage, went inside, closed the door, and stood with her back against it, in the dim interior that she had never needed a candle to navigate. Then, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Mabel let herself cry. Not from grief exactly, not from fear, though that was part of it, but from the exhausting, bone-deep weight of being known, even partially, even obliquely, by someone who had not turned that knowledge into a weapon. He knew, or near enough to knowing that the difference was only words, and he had warned her anyway. She slid down the back of the door until she was sitting on the cold stone floor, knees drawn up, face pressed against her folded arms. Outside, the wind moved through the pine wood at the edge of the village and made a sound like the world breathing. She could hear the distant sound of horses. Not at the inn, not belonging to anyone she recognized, moving along the northern road, unhurried, searching. Roden's men. 2 days away, he had said, moving village to village. She raised her head and looked at the room with clear, unclouded eyes. Really looked, the way she never allowed herself to look with anyone present. And understood with a cold, settling certainty that the life she had built here, in this small room with its worn table and its single pot, and its shelves of thread, was not going to survive the next week. The only question that remained was whether she would. She began packing before the sun moved another hand's width across the sky. It was an old instinct, packing, the kind that lived in the body rather than the mind, that didn't require thought or decision, only motion. She had packed like this once before, at 19, in a frozen northern territory with one good boot and a stolen cloak, and the sound of dogs somewhere behind her in the dark. The motion came back to her with terrible familiarity. Hands moving, breath controlled, eyes clear. The leather satchel first, herbs, needle case, the small purse of coins she kept sewn into the lining of her heaviest cloak, the cloak itself, folded tight. A second dress, wool, rolled and tied, a heel of bread wrapped in cloth. The iron token, which she held for a moment before placing it deliberately at the bottom of the satchel beneath everything else. She was tying the satchel closed when someone knocked on her door. Not Dominic's knock. She already knew his, the unhurried, deliberate weight of it. This was lighter, faster, nervous. She arranged her expression, softened her eyes, and opened the door. The young guard she had glimpsed behind Dominic in the market square stood on her step. He was perhaps 22, dark-haired, with a watchful face, and the particular rigid posture of someone trying to appear more certain than they felt. His hand rested near his blade with practiced habit. "The king requests your presence," he said. Then, with visible discomfort, added, "Immediately." His name, she would learn later, was Cale. He said it grudgingly when she asked, as though names were a resource to be rationed. He did not offer his hand to guide her, and she did not reach for one, and they walked the length of the village in a silence that was not quite hostile, but was not comfortable either. She could feel his suspicion like a second presence walking alongside them. Dominic was not at the inn. Cale led her to the northern edge of the village, where the road to the mountains began as a pale track between dark fields. 3 horses stood ready there, 2 of them loaded with saddlebags. Dominic stood at the head of the largest, a heavy black animal that shifted and stilled at his touch with the ease of long familiarity. He turned when he heard them approach, and his eyes went directly to the satchel on her shoulder. "You're already packed," he said. "I was going to leave tonight," she said honestly. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise, she thought, but a kind of recognition. "Where?" "Somewhere smaller than this. Further south." She kept her chin level, her voice even. "It's what I do." "How many times?" She considered lying. "4, since I left." He looked at her for a long moment, that full, direct attention that she had stopped being able to deflect even in her own mind. Then he said, "Rodon's trackers are not 2 days away. I received word an hour ago. They're half a day's ride north and moving faster than anticipated. They have a scent trail." His voice was measured, but underneath it she could hear the edge of something controlled very deliberately. "They're following you, Mabel." The cold seemed to deepen around her. "They've been tracking you for weeks," he continued, "since before I arrived here. I don't believe my coming to Ashfin is what drew them. I believe they were already close, and I simply arrived first." He paused. "Which means leaving tonight on foot will not be sufficient." She understood what he was not quite saying. She looked at the 3 horses, at the 2 loaded saddlebags, at the road north, and then at the road south, which was the direction Dominic was clearly not looking. "You're offering to take me with you," she said. "I'm offering you the protection of the Lycan throne," he said, "which means travel under my guard, through my territory, to my seat at Vordheim, where Rodin's men cannot follow without committing an act of war against the crown." A beat. "It is not a small thing I'm asking you to accept. I know that." Cale, standing 2 steps behind her, made a sound that was not quite a word, a slight exhale, tightly controlled, that communicated his opinion of this arrangement without requiring him to voice it directly. She filed that away. "Why?" she asked. Not the logistical why. She understood the logistics. The deeper why. The one that had no clean official answer. Dominic was quiet for a moment. The wind came down from the mountains and moved through his dark braids and carried the smell of coming snow. "I told you about my sister," he said. "You did. I spent 3 years looking for a woman I'd never met to prevent something from happening that I could have prevented 6 years earlier if I had known." His jaw tightened briefly. "I don't intend to arrive late a second time." Mabel stood on the frozen road with the wind in her face and the weight of 10 years in her satchel, and looked at him. Truly looked, openly, making no pretense at all, letting her eyes do what they had always been capable of doing, and hadn't been allowed to do in public for a decade. He noticed. He said nothing about it. He simply waited. "If I come with you," she said carefully, "I need you to understand something." "Tell me." "I am not looking to be claimed. By anyone. That is not a negotiation." "I know. And I will not pretend to be something I'm not. Not anymore." Her voice held steady on that last part, though it cost her something to say it. "Whatever this is, wherever this leads, I won't go back to hiding." "Good," he said simply. And something in the simplicity of it reached past every careful wall she had built, and touched something underneath that she hadn't known was still accessible. She picked up the satchel strap. All right. Cale's skepticism sat in the saddle like a physical thing for the first day of riding. He positioned himself at the rear of their small party with the deliberate distance of a man who had registered an objection and been overruled and intended to make that known through posture alone. When they stopped at dusk to water the horses at a narrow stream cutting through pine-shadowed ground, he came to stand near Mabel with the barely contained energy of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity. "You can see," he said. Low, flat, direct. She didn't insult him by pretending confusion. "Yes." His nostrils flared. "For how long?" "Always." He stared at her for a moment. The stream ran cold and quick between ice-edged stones. Above the pines, the sky had gone the deep blue of early winter evening, the first stars just becoming visible. "You lied," he said. "For years, to everyone. And now he's riding you through his own territory under crown protection based on the fact that a man is hunting me," she said quietly. "And your king chose to do something about it." She met his gaze without flinching. "I understand why you don't trust me. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to let me earn it." Cale's jaw worked. He had the face of someone engaged in a genuine internal argument, the kind where both sides had real merit. He looked away, back toward the horses, toward Dominic, who was crouched at the stream's edge refilling a water skin, and very deliberately not watching this conversation. "He trusted you before you told him anything," Cale said, and the flatness in his voice had shifted into something more complicated. Not accusation exactly, but concern. Real concern, for someone he clearly cared about protecting. "That is not typical of him." "I know," she said. "It worries me." "That's your job," she said. "Keep worrying. It means you're paying attention." He looked at her again. Something changed in his expression. The rigid skepticism didn't disappear, but it shifted slightly, made room for something more considered. He walked away without agreeing to anything. But that night, when they made camp in the shelter of a pine grove with a small fire built from dry deadwood, Cale arranged the bedrolls so that his was between the tree line and hers, and his hand was near his blade all night, and he kept watch until dawn without being asked. They reached Vordheim on the 5th day. Mabel had imagined it as a fortress, cold stone, high walls, the architecture of power expressed through intimidation. What she found was larger and stranger than that. A city built into the side of a mountain, its oldest structures hewn from the rock itself. Newer buildings spreading outward in concentric rings down the slope like rings in water. The gates were iron and ancient, set with the wolf's head sigil in dark metal, worn smooth by weather and decades of hands. The great hall smelled of wood smoke, pine resin, and old stone. Tapestries hung from the high walls. Battle scenes, hunting scenes, and among them, unexpectedly, quieter things. A woman at a loom, a child asleep beside a fire, a figure standing at a mountain's edge looking outward. Dominic walked her through it without ceremony or announcement, which she understood was its own kind of gift. That same evening, in the council chamber with its heavy oak table and the smell of old parchment and melted wax, Dominic formally rejected Roden's claim. Not with a long legal argument. Not with a council debate that dragged across days. He sat at the head of the table with Cale at his right hand and 2 senior council members at his left, and he set a document on the table, one he had written himself, Mabel would learn later, the night before they left Ashfen, and he signed it with a seal that meant it was absolute. The claim of desertion filed against the Omega known to Duskville Pack was rejected in full. The tracker party operating south without Crown authority was ordered to stand down and return north under penalty of sanction. The Alpha of Duskvale was formally notified that any future claim filed against an unmated Omega on unclaimed territory would require evidence of willing, witnessed consent, a standard Rodan could not meet. It was, Cale explained to her afterward, the first time in 80 years that the throne had issued a direct protective decree for an individual Omega. Mabel sat in the stone window seat of the room she had been given. A real room, high-ceilinged, with a thick wool rug and a proper hearth, and a candle she lit because she wanted to, not because she needed to, and read the document twice. Her name was in it. Her real name, not a fiction, not a performance. Mabel, Omega, under the protection of the Lycan crown. She pressed the parchment flat against her knee and looked out the window at the mountain above Vordheim, dark against the winter stars. Roden did not accept the decree quietly. In the weeks that followed, reports came to Vordheim in steady succession. Formal objections from Duskville, then informal pressure sent through intermediary alphas, then finally, the thing Dominic had been waiting for. Roden arrived at Vordheim himself, uninvited and furious, with 12 men at his back and the particular reckless confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone who could enforce it. Mabel was in the great hall when he arrived. She had not been hidden, not been moved to a back room, not been asked to wait elsewhere. She stood near the fire with Cale at her side. Cale, who had stopped pretending to distrust her somewhere around the third day of riding, and now simply occupied her proximity with the matter-of-fact steadiness of someone who had decided a thing and didn't need to announce it. Roden was not what she had feared for 10 years. He was simply a man, broad and red-faced, with a bully's bluster and a coward's eyes, the kind of man who had learned to be large in small spaces and had mistaken that for power. He scanned the hall and found her, and his expression moved through surprise into something ugly. Dominic stepped forward before Roden could speak. What followed was not a battle. There was no violence, no blood on the old stone floor. Dominic stood at the center of his own hall with the quiet authority of a man in the exact right place and spoke with precise, unhurried clarity about the law. The actual law, not the version that men like Roden had been bending and reshaping for their own convenience for decades. He spoke about the decree, about the tracked route of Roden's private men, about 6 years of records from Duskville that Dominic's people had spent 3 years quietly collecting. Roden blustered, threatened, appealed to old alliances and older traditions. Dominic let him finish. Then he said, very quietly, that Roden could accept the terms of the decree and return to his territory, or he could be formally stripped of his alpha standing before a full council convened within the fortnight. He made both options sound equally manageable. The difference was that one of them ended with Roden still holding something. Roden left before nightfall. He did not look at Mabel again on his way out. He was too busy looking at the floor. When the great doors closed behind him, the hall breathed out. Cale said very quietly, near her ear, "That's usually how it goes when people mistake patience for weakness." Mabel exhaled. "Does it always feel like this afterward? Like you've been holding your breath for a month?" "Yes," he considered. "Honestly, yes." A pause. "You get used to it." She laughed. A real one. The kind that surprised her by happening. Cale's expression shifted into something that was close to a smile, close enough that it counted. Winter deepened over Vordheim in the weeks that followed, and Mabel found that she had stopped waiting to leave. It was not a dramatic decision. It did not arrive in a single moment of clarity. It was more like the slow thawing of ground that has been frozen for a long time, gradual, quiet, happening in the dark, before it became visible. She took a permanent room. She began sewing again. Real work, good work, the kind done in clear light without pretense. She mended Cale's leather bracers when the stitching split, and he accepted this with a gruffness that was his version of gratitude. She learned the names of the kitchen women and the stable boys and the elderly council scribe named Osbert, who had served 3 kings and smelled permanently of ink and dried sage. She walked the corridors of Vordheim's older sections with her eyes open, truly open, reading the old tapestries and the worn carvings on the walls and the details of a world she had been pretending not to see for 10 years. Dominic found her in the library one morning, a deep, cold room full of shelves that reached the ceiling and smelled beautifully of old leather and dust, where she had been standing for some time, reading the spine of every book within reach. "You can read," he said, not accusingly, simply noting it. "I could always read," she said, "among other things." He came to stand beside her at the shelf. The morning light from the high window fell across the spines of the books and across the side of his face, and she looked at him, the way she had been allowing herself to look at things for weeks now, without performance, without management. "I owe you an apology," she said. "You owe me nothing. I deceived you." "You survived," he said. "Those aren't the same thing." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the library window, snow was falling again. The soft, unhurried snow of deep winter, settling on the stone ledges in smooth silence. "I don't know how to be seen," she said finally. The admission was quieter than she intended, more honest than she had planned. "I spent so long making myself invisible. I'm not sure I know what the alternative looks like." He turned to look at her, not with the full weight of authority, not with the measuring quality she had first encountered in Ashvin's market square, but with something simpler and more difficult to deflect. "It looks like this," he said. "Exactly this." Spring came to Vordheim the way it always came to mountain places, late and sudden, arriving one morning as a smell in the air rather than a change in temperature, something green and alive pushing up through the cold. The snow on the upper peaks didn't retreat, but in the lower rings of the city, the frozen ground began to soften, and the pine wood below the walls put out new growth, pale and sharp-scented. Mabel stood at the gate on a morning in early spring and breathed it in with open lungs and open eyes. She had sent word to Petra in Ashvin, a letter, carefully written, explaining only that she was safe and well settled and would not be returning. She had sent a second letter to Eloise, which included measurements for a new dress, because it felt like the right thing to do. She had received a reply from Eloise that was 3 pages long and contained mostly exclamation marks, and one line near the end that read, "I told my husband there was something about you, Mabel. I told him from the very first fitting." Cale found her at the gate, as he often did in the mornings now, a habit that had formed without either of them noting its formation. He stood beside her and looked out at the pine wood with the expression of a man entirely comfortable with silence. "He's going to ask you to stay permanently," Cale said after a while. "I know. What will you say?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Felt the weight of 10 years in it, and underneath that, something lighter. The particular lightness of a thing that had been set down after being carried too long. "I'll say yes," she said, "but I'm going to say it in my own time." Cale nodded slowly. "That seems right." She smiled, and it was the real version. Not the soft, careful smile she had given the world for a decade, but the one underneath it, the one that didn't have to be managed. She said yes on a quiet evening in late spring, in the library, with snow still on the high peaks and the smell of pine and old books around them, and no one else present. No ceremony, no formal declaration. She simply told him, in clear and direct words, that she was choosing to stay, not because she had been rescued, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because this was where she wanted to be. Dominic listened to all of it. Then he said, "All right," in the same quiet tone he had used the very first time she had set a condition, as though her choosing had always been the only outcome he was willing to accept. They were not the same people who had stood on opposite sides of a village well in the frost. He was not the same king who had arrived in Ashvin with the weight of authority and a 3-year search behind him. She was not the woman who had pressed her hands flat against a cold stone wall and trembled at the thought of being found. Mabel kept her eyes open now, all the time, without apology. The world she had been pretending not to see turned out, on close inspection, to be larger and more detailed and considerably more worth looking at than she had let herself believe. And for the first time in 10 years, perhaps for the first time in her life, she looked at it without fear. Cale remained at Vordheim, serving as the king's closest guard, and in time, as something closer to a trusted friend than either of them would admit aloud. He never fully abandoned his habit of standing between Mabel and any doorway she hadn't yet assessed, and she never asked him to. Rodan lost his alpha standing the following autumn, not from Dominic's decree, but from a challenge within his own pack, the kind of ending that comes not from outside force, but from the inevitable collapse of something built entirely on fear. Petra received the letter, read it twice, and told every customer for the next month that she had always known Mabel was destined for something larger. She was not entirely wrong, and Dominic, king of all Lycan territories, who had spent 3 years searching for a woman he'd never met, out of something that was not quite guilt and not quite duty, but lived in the space between them, found, in the end, that the searching had been its own kind of answer. That what he had been moving toward, through all those roads and all those cold mornings, was not a resolution, but a beginning. The library at Vordheim gained 2 more readers that year. The candle on the windowsill burned every night, and Mabel, who had spent a decade making herself invisible, finally completely, and without reservation, allowed herself to be seen.